The emergency room went dead silent when the chief surgeon ripped the badge off her scrubs and threw it onto the floor. "You think you're a hero?" Dr. Marcus Holt's voice cut through every corner of that hallway. "You're a nurse. You follow orders. You don't make decisions that could kill people." She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She picked up the badge, set it on the counter, and walked out. Nobody in that hospital knew the woman they just fired had once carried wounded Navy SEALs out of a burning building while enemy fire tore the air apart around her. They were about to find out. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with, this story is for you. Hit subscribe and follow this channel so you never miss what happens next. Every week we bring you stories that will shake you, stories about real strength, hidden courage, and the moments when the truth finally comes out. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The overnight shift at Callaway Regional Medical Center started the way most of them did, with the smell of floor wax and old coffee, a hallway lit too bright for the hour, and the particular kind of quiet that only hospitals get at 2 in the morning, right before everything falls apart. Nora Voss changed into her scrubs in the staff locker room without talking to anyone. She was good at that. She'd spent years learning how to move through spaces without taking up too much of them, how to be useful without being noticed, how to answer when spoken to and stay quiet when she wasn't. She clipped her ID badge to her collar, checked the time on the plain black watch on her left wrist, and pushed out into the corridor. Callaway Regional sat on the edge of Harwick, a mid-sized city in western Tennessee that most people drove through without stopping. The hospital was the largest employer in the county, which meant it carried a kind of institutional weight that made the people inside it feel more important than the building probably deserved. The trauma wing had 17 beds. The staff rotated in waves of exhaustion and resentment. And at the top of all of it, like a ceiling that never stopped pressing down, was Dr. Marcus Holt, Chief of Trauma Surgery. 14 years at Callaway, winner of 2 Regional Excellence Awards whose framed certificates hung on his office wall in a way that made sure you saw them the moment you walked in. Nora had been at Callaway for 9 months, long enough to know which supply closets were stocked and which weren't, long enough to memorize every nurse's break schedule and every attending physician's tolerance for being questioned, long enough to understand that the hierarchy at this hospital was not about competence. It was about rank. And rank was something Dr. Marcus Holt enforced the way other people breathed, automatically, constantly, without examining whether it was actually helping anyone. She had met him on her first day. He'd looked at her file, looked at her, and said, 9 months at St. Agatha's before this? Referring to her one prior civilian nursing position. That's a thin resume for a trauma floor. She'd said, I'll do the work. He'd said, yes, you will, and nothing else. That was the whole relationship, laid out in 30 seconds. She moved through this handoff without incident, taking over from Jamie Reyes, a third-year nurse who had the specific look of someone who had been awake too long and was currently running on spite and vending machine crackers. Bed 4 is stable but anxious. Bed 7 is post-op, vitals normal. Bed 12? Jamie paused, pulling her mouth into a tight line. Bed 12 came in an hour ago. 41-year-old male, motorcycle versus guardrail. Holt cleared him for observation after imaging and said his pressure drop was anxiety-related. Nora looked at the chart Jamie handed her. Anxiety-related. That's what the man said. What does his abdomen feel like? I didn't get the chance to... Okay. Nora took the chart. Go home. Jamie gave her a look that was equal parts gratitude and pity, the way people looked at someone who was walking into a room they'd just escaped and left. Nora went to bed 12 first. The patient's name was Darren Okafor. He was built wide and solid, the kind of man who looked like he'd been in physical pain before and knew how to sit through it without making noise. He was doing that now, sitting through it. His hands were loose at his sides, his jaw was set, but his eyes, when they found her, had something in them that people who weren't paying attention would have missed entirely. He was scared, not anxious, scared. The way people got scared when their body was telling them something was going wrong and they couldn't stop it. Mr. Okafor, She pulled the curtain closed behind her. I'm Nora. I'm your nurse for the rest of the night. Can you tell me where you're feeling pain right now? They said I was fine, he said. His voice was steady but effortful, the way a voice got when keeping it steady costs something. The doctor said imaging looked okay. I'd like to hear it from you. Where's the pain? He glanced at the curtain like he was checking whether someone could hear him. Then he pressed 2 fingers just below his left ribs. Here. It's been building since they brought me in. Not sharp, more like pressure, like something is full that shouldn't be. Nora put her hand on his abdomen, gently. She palpated without comment, moving her fingers in a slow, methodical grid. When she reached the left upper quadrant, she felt it. A subtle rigidity. Involuntary guarding. His body bracing against something it knew was there. His blood pressure reading on the chart was 104/68. The notation said patient anxious, BP trending low, monitoring. She looked at his skin, slightly pale at the margins, not yellow, not blue, but not right either. Have you been nauseated? A little. Thought it was from the crash. Any dizziness when you shift positions? Yeah, but the doctor said, I know what the doctor said. She kept her voice even. I'm asking what you feel. He looked at her for a moment. I feel like something is wrong. Okay, she said. I'll be right back. She went to the nursing station and pulled his full lab work. The CBC from 2 hours ago showed a hematocrit of 36, not alarming on its own, but the repeat draw Jamie had logged 40 minutes ago, the one nobody had followed up on, showed it had dropped to 31, 5 points in 40 minutes. Nora felt the particular stillness that came over her in these moments, the one that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with focus. She'd felt it in other places, in other conditions, in the dark, with her hands doing work she didn't think about afterward. It was a narrowing, a shedding of everything that wasn't the immediate problem. She paged Dr. Holt. He called back 4 minutes later, and she could hear from the first syllable that she'd interrupted something. What is it? Bed 12, Darren Okafor. Hematocrit dropped 5 points in 40 minutes. He's got left upper quadrant guarding and pressure around 104/68. I'm concerned about... I already evaluated that patient. His repeat labs came back since your evaluation. A 5-point drop can be within normal variance for a post-traumatic patient. His imaging was clean. CT imaging can miss a splenic laceration if the bleeding is slow and the scan timing is... Nurse Voss. His voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted to remind you of something. I am aware of what CT imaging can and cannot do. I evaluated that patient. I made a clinical determination. Your job is to monitor and report, not to second-guess attending physicians. She held the phone against her ear for a moment. In the background, she could hear the television he was watching, late-night sports recap, crowd noise and commentary. I'd like to get a repeat pressure now and another CBC, she said. Then do that. That's your job. Don't page me again unless the numbers are significantly outside normal range. He hung up. She went back to Darren Okafor's room. His pressure was 98/61. She drew the blood herself for the new CBC and sent it to the lab on urgent priority. Then she stood at his bedside and watched the monitor. She watched the small lines trace their paths across the screen. She watched the numbers shift in increments that most people wouldn't notice. She noticed. 17 minutes later, the lab called her back. Hematocrit, 28. She did not page Dr. Holt again. She looked at the man in the bed who was now beginning to shift uncomfortably, one hand pressed to his left side, color retreating from his face the way color did when blood was going somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the IV line running into his arm. Then she pulled the crash cart to the door, informed the charge nurse she was upgrading bed 12, and began the intervention herself. It was not a complicated decision. It was not even really a decision in the way people meant when they talked about hard choices. It was the same thing it had always been for her, a reading of a situation and an appropriate response. She was fast and she was quiet and she didn't narrate what she was doing. She started aggressive IV fluid resuscitation, elevated his legs, keyed the overhead intercom to request surgical backup, and stayed at his side with her eyes on the monitor and her hands ready. By the time Dr. Holt arrived 12 minutes later, Darren Okafor's pressure had stabilized enough for a surgical team to take him safely to the OR, where they found a grade 3 splenic laceration actively bleeding into his abdominal cavity. He would have been dead by morning. Dr. Marcus Holt did not say anything to Nora that night. He took over in the hallway outside the OR suite, and she stepped back the way she always stepped back, not retreating, just making room. And she finished the shift and wrote her notes and clocked out at 7:15 in the morning with the sun coming sideways through the east-facing windows. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong about that. The meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. the following Thursday. She found out about it Tuesday afternoon, when the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia Whaley, who had been at Callaway for 19 years and had the exhausted decency of someone who'd watched too many good people get chewed up by the place, stopped her in the supply corridor. "They want you in the administrative conference room Thursday," Patricia said. She handed her the formal notice without looking at her directly. Dr. Holt filed a conduct report. Nora read it. The language was specific and cold. Unauthorized scope of practice, failure to defer to attending physician decision, pattern of insubordination. There was a line near the bottom that said patient outcome notwithstanding, which was the part that told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. "Patient's alive," Nora said. "I know that. Does that matter?" Patricia finally looked at her. Her eyes had the particular sadness of someone who'd given the same answer before. "It matters to the patient," she said, and walked away. The conference room at Callaway Regional was on the 4th floor with a view of the parking structure and a long table that seated 12. When Nora arrived Thursday morning, 5 people were seated at that table. Dr. Holt, the hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Ferris, who wore his suit slightly too large and had the energy of someone who had chosen institutional loyalty over personal conviction so long ago he'd forgotten there was ever a choice. The head of nursing, Sandra Breen, who Nora had spoken to exactly 3 times in 9 months, legal counsel, and a woman from HR named Donna Lattimore, who took notes on a yellow legal pad. Nora sat down across from them. "Ms. Voss," Gerald Ferris began, "this meeting has been called to address concerns raised by Dr. Holt regarding your conduct during the shift of the 14th. You should know this is a formal review process." "I understand. Dr. Holt, would you like to summarize your concerns?" Marcus Holt had the composure of a man who had run enough of these meetings to know that composure was its own kind of power. He sat with his hands folded. He spoke without hurry. "I evaluated Darren Okafor on his admission. I made a clinical determination based on imaging and presentation that the patient was appropriate for observation. Nurse Voss contacted me with concerns, which I addressed. She then proceeded, without authorization, to initiate interventions outside the defined scope of nursing practice, bypassing the attending of record and escalating to surgical backup independently." He paused. "The patient's outcome was fortunate, but this hospital cannot function if nursing staff override physician judgment every time they disagree with a clinical call. This is a patient safety issue." Nora listened to all of it. She had a way of listening that some people found unsettling. She was still in a way that felt less like passivity and more like patience, the way certain trained people got still. "Do you have a response?" Ferris asked her. "His hematocrit dropped 9 points in under an hour," she said. "He had guarding, hypotension trending down, and mechanism of injury consistent with splenic trauma. I paged Dr. Holt. I reported my findings. He told me to monitor. When monitoring indicated the patient was decompensating, I acted." "You acted outside your scope," Holt said. "He would have died. That is not a determination nursing staff are authorized to make." She looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing in her face that he could take hold of and use. "I disagree," she said. The room shifted slightly, the way rooms do when something that was implicit becomes explicit. Ferris cleared his throat. "Ms. Voss, I want you to understand that we appreciate your commitment to patient care, but Callaway Regional operates within defined clinical hierarchies for good reason. Dr. Holt has raised serious concerns about your ability to function appropriately within that structure." He glanced at Sandra Breen, who gave a small nod that had the look of something rehearsed. We believe it would be in the best interest of the hospital and the staff to place you on administrative leave while the review is completed. Paid? A slight pause. Unpaid, given the nature of the... I understand, she said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at Marcus Holt, who was watching her with the steady eyes of a man who had already decided how this story ended. The patient's name is Darren Okafor, she said. He has 3 children. He coaches youth basketball on weekends. If you'd like the outcome to matter to someone in this room, it might as well be on record. She left without waiting for a response. The next 5 days had a texture she recognized from a different part of her life. The texture of waiting without resolution, of holding still while things moved around you, of maintaining function when the structure that usually held everything in place had been removed. She ran in the mornings. She made coffee. She reorganized the kitchen cabinets she'd been ignoring since she moved into the apartment. She didn't call her sister because her sister would want to help and there was nothing to help with yet. She didn't call any of her former colleagues because that was a door she'd closed and she wasn't in the habit of going back through closed doors. She'd had another life before this one. She didn't think about it constantly. She thought about it the way you thought about certain weather. You didn't forget what a storm felt like just because the sky was currently clear. It informed things. The way she moved, the way she assessed rooms when she entered them, the way she read people's faces for what they weren't saying. The way she'd known, the moment she put her hand on Darren Okafor's abdomen, exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to happen next. That life had been over for 3 years. She'd left it by choice, which some people thought meant she'd left it cleanly. She hadn't. She'd left it carrying things she didn't have language for yet, and the hospital had seemed like a place where those things could be used for something, where the part of her that knew how to stay calm inside a crisis could actually help someone who needed it. On the 5th day of leave, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. Nora Voss? A man's voice. Even. Professional. With a quality underneath it that she would have recognized anywhere. The quality of someone who had operated in environments where everything depended on reading situations correctly. Who is this? My name is Conrad Briggs. I'm calling on behalf of a mutual acquaintance, a man named Darren Okafor. A pause. He'd like to thank you in person, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment. He's recovering well? He's out of the hospital, doing fine. He's also, well, he's not exactly a civilian, Ms. Voss, and neither am I. Another pause. I think we may have more in common than you know. She looked out her apartment window at the parking lot below. A pickup truck was pulling out of a space. A kid was running after a dog that had gotten loose from its leash. Ordinary afternoon. Ordinary city. Where? She said. What? She met Conrad Briggs at a diner on Westfield Avenue, 4 blocks from her apartment 2 days later. He was already seated when she arrived. A man in his late 40s, compact and deliberate, wearing civilian clothes that sat on him with the particular wrongness of someone more accustomed to different clothing. He had the kind of face that didn't give you much and wasn't trying to. Across from him sat Darren Okafor, who looked larger out of a hospital bed than he had in one. He still moved carefully, favoring his left side, but his color was good and his eyes were clear. He stood up when she walked in, which she hadn't expected. "Sit down," she said. "You just had abdominal surgery." "I know." He sat. "Thank you for coming." She ordered coffee and didn't say anything until it arrived. "Conrad told me you're not military," Okafor said. "Former military." "That's right." "Special Operations Medical?" She looked at him. "What did you used to do, Mr. Okafor?" He smiled, just briefly, at the redirect. "Naval Intelligence, 14 years. I've been out for 2. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm telling you this because I think you need to know who you helped. And I think you need to know what I know about why you're currently on leave." She waited. "The hospital's review isn't a standard conduct review," he said. "Dr. Holt has a relationship with the board that goes back a long time. Gerald Ferris covers for him. There have been 3 prior complaints about Holt from nursing staff in the past 4 years. None of them made it to formal action. He paused. You're not the first nurse he's done this to, but you may be the last one he does it to without a fight. What kind of fight are you suggesting? Conrad Briggs spoke for the first time since she'd sat down. The kind where you're not standing alone, he said. She looked at both of them. She thought about the supply corridor and Patricia Whaley's face. She thought about Gerald Ferris saying patient outcome notwithstanding in the same tone of voice most people used to describe bad weather. She thought about the overhead fluorescent lights in that conference room and how she'd felt sitting across from 5 people who'd already made their decision and were simply making her sit through the performance of it. What are you proposing? She asked. Okafor leaned back. His hand moved to his left side for just a moment, unconscious, then away. Conrad has some connections, he said. People who know what you did. People who might be interested in ensuring the story doesn't end with you getting quietly pushed out of a job for saving my life. Darren, she said, I don't need people to fight for me. I know that, he said. That's why I wanted to meet you. He looked at her directly, the way people looked at you when they weren't performing anything. I'm not here to rescue you. I'm here because you saved my life, and because I think you deserve to know that you're not alone in this. What you do with that is your business. She drank her coffee. Outside, a bus pulled up to the stop on the corner and opened its doors, and 3 people climbed out into the afternoon, and the doors closed again, and the bus moved on. Tell me what you know about Holt, she said. Tem. She was at the grocery store the following Tuesday when her phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. 3 words. Decision came down. She paid for her groceries, drove home, and called Patricia Whaley, whose number she still had from a previous shift swap. Patricia answered on the second ring. Nora. Her voice had the same quality it had in the supply corridor, the voice of someone who'd been given bad news and hadn't figured out what to do with it yet. They finalized the review this morning. I wanted to call you, but I didn't know if... What did they decide? A pause, long enough to carry its own meaning. They're terminating your employment, Patricia said, effective immediately. Holt's conduct report was upheld. They're classifying it as a patient safety concern. Her voice dropped. I'm sorry. I vouched for you internally, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something, Nora said. Thank you, Patricia. She stood in her kitchen with the phone at her side and the grocery bags on the counter and the afternoon light coming through the window at a low angle that turned everything slightly gold. She stood very still. Not because she was devastated, though there was something in her chest that was real and heavy, but because she was thinking. She was thinking about Conrad Briggs saying people who know what you did. She was thinking about Darren Okafor's hand moving to his left side. She was thinking about a decision that had taken a man to the edge of death and then brought him back, and how that decision had been made by her, alone, in a fluorescent-lit room at 3 a.m, because she had done it before in the dark, in the dirt, in conditions that made a hospital hallway look like the safest place on earth. She was thinking about what it cost to be quiet for 9 months, and what it might cost to stop. She put the groceries away. She made a phone call. And somewhere across the city, in an office she'd never been to, a man named Conrad Briggs picked up on the first ring. Conrad Briggs answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been expecting the call. They finalized it, she said. I know. He didn't ask how she knew that he knew. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Where? He gave her an address on the east side of Harwick, near the industrial corridor where the older office buildings sat between auto body shops and logistics warehouses, the kind of neighborhood that didn't ask questions about who was coming and going. She wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt and put it on the counter next to her keys. 8 o'clock, he said. I'll be there. She slept better than she expected to, which said something about the difference between uncertainty and resolution. The review being finalized was bad news, but it was known bad news, and known things, even bad ones, had edges you could work with. The building on Kellner Street had no signage on the exterior. It was 3 stories, brick, with a ground floor entrance that looked like the kind of door that was always locked. It wasn't. She pushed through into a lobby with gray industrial carpet and a security desk where a man in civilian clothes checked her ID without conversation, made a call, and waved her through. Conrad Briggs met her at the elevator on the 2nd floor. He was wearing the same kind of clothes as the day at the diner, civilian clothes that didn't quite fit the way civilian clothes should, and he had a paper coffee cup in each hand. He extended one toward her. "I have questions," she said, taking it. "I know. I'll answer what I can." He turned and walked down the corridor, and she followed. The office he led her into was small and functional. A table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, a window facing the brick wall of the building next door. Sitting at the table was a woman Nora hadn't met before. Late 30s, brown hair pulled back, dressed in a way that was deliberately nondescript. She had a laptop open in front of her, and the kind of posture that came from a long time of being in rooms where posture was noticed. "This is Sloan," Conrad said. "She's been working the Holt situation for about 6 weeks." The woman, Sloan, looked at Nora directly. "Darren spoke highly of you." "He shouldn't have needed to," Nora said. Something in Sloan's expression shifted, just slightly. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Fair," she said. "Sit down." Nora sat. What she learned in the next 40 minutes reorganized the shape of everything she thought she understood about her 9 months at Callaway Regional. Marcus Holt was not just a difficult physician protecting his authority, he was the visible surface of something larger. Over the past 6 years, Callaway Regional had been quietly shifting its clinical structure, reducing nursing oversight authority, centralizing decision-making in the surgical department, insulating attending physicians from meaningful accountability. On paper, it looked like administrative efficiency. In practice, it meant that people like Holt could make bad calls without consequence, as long as the bad calls didn't produce the kind of outcome that generated headlines. Most of the time, they hadn't. "We've identified 3 patients in the last 2 years whose outcomes were significantly worse than they should have been given presentation and available intervention," Sloan said. She turned the laptop toward Nora. The screen showed a spreadsheet with dates, case numbers, and coded annotations. None of them died, but all 3 had preventable complications that extended hospital stays and in 2 cases resulted in permanent medical consequences. Who are these patients? People who didn't know they had recourse. People who trusted the process. Sloan paused. And in each case, a nurse filed an internal concern. And in each case, the concern was reclassified as a performance issue and the nurse was eventually pushed out. Nora looked at the spreadsheet for a moment. "You've been building this for 6 weeks. Longer than that, if I'm being honest, but the structure became clearer 6 weeks ago when Darren was admitted and what happened. Sloan closed the laptop. "Holt's conduct report on you isn't just him protecting his ego. It's institutional. The termination was a coordinated decision." Gerald Ferris, and at least 2 board members. Yes. Nora set her coffee down. The cup was almost empty. She turned it slowly in her hands, the cardboard slightly soft from the heat. "What do you need from me?" Conrad leaned forward. "Your employment file. Your nursing documentation. Your charting from the Okafor admission and everything before it. The paging log, if you have access to the system record." "I don't have access anymore. My credentials were deactivated when the termination was finalized." "Patricia Whaley does," Sloan said. Nora looked at her. "You want me to ask Patricia to pull records?" "We want you to consider it. Patricia vouched for you internally. She's been at that hospital long enough to know where the bodies are buried. Metaphorically." Sloan held her gaze. "We're not asking you to do anything illegal. The records we need are records of your own practice. Your own charting. And if Patricia gets caught pulling them?" "That's a real risk," Conrad said. "We're not going to pretend otherwise." She appreciated that. The not pretending otherwise. It was the kind of honesty that cost something, and she'd learned a long time ago to pay attention to what people were willing to let cost them. "Let me talk to Patricia," Nora said. Patricia Whaley lived in a house in the Denfield neighborhood, 20 minutes from the hospital, in a quiet street with old oak trees that cracked the sidewalk with their roots. She answered the door in her off-duty clothes, sweatshirt, jeans, reading glasses pushed up on her head, and her face when she saw Nora did the thing faces did when you were surprised but not shocked, because some part of you had been halfway expecting this. "Come in," she said. The house was lived in the way that made it feel like a real place. A jacket thrown over a chair, a half-finished cup of tea on the coffee table, a tabby cat sitting on top of the bookshelf with the authority of an animal who'd decided the highest point in the room belonged to it. Patricia cleared a stack of folders off the couch, and they both sat. "I need to tell you something first," Patricia said before Nora could speak. "Before you tell me why you're here." Nora waited. "After your meeting with administration, I started looking at my own records. Things I'd documented over the years. Concerns I'd flagged. Issues I'd been told were resolved." She picked up her tea, noticed it was cold, set it back down. 3 years ago, I wrote a formal complaint about Holt. It was regarding a patient in post-op whose deterioration was called anxiety by Holt, and who ended up in the ICU for 11 days with a complication that should have been caught earlier. What happened to the complaint? It was reviewed and closed. I was told the case was clinically complex and Holt's decision-making had been appropriate given available information. She pulled her glasses off her head and held them in her hands. 6 months later, I received my performance review. For the first time in 16 years, I was rated needs improvement in the category of interdepartmental communication. They documented it. Patricia confirmed. Nothing formal enough to stick, but enough to sit in my file. The cat jumped off the bookshelf and padded across the room and settled on Patricia's lap, immediately and without asking, and Patricia's hand went down to it automatically, the way you did with animals you'd had a long time. "If I ask you to pull records," Nora said, "you need to understand what I'm involved in." "Tell me." She told her. Not everything. She didn't know everything, but what she knew. What Sloan had told her. What Darren Okafor had said in the diner. What Conrad Briggs had built in an office that didn't have its name on the door. Patricia listened the way she listened to patient reports, thoroughly, without interrupting, filing things as they came in. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The charting from your shift," Patricia said finally. "The paging log. The lab timestamps." "Yes. Those are accessible in the system. Nursing documentation is archived for compliance purposes. You were the nurse of record on that shift, so technically the records of your practice are your records." "I can't access the system anymore." "I can." Patricia looked down at the cat. "There are 3 other nurses who were pushed out in the last 4 years. Kira Strand, who left in 2021, Mateo Garza, 2022, and Bev Holden, who was here for 12 years before they moved her out 18 months ago." She looked up. "I kept in touch with all 3. Nora looked at her. "Would they talk?" "If someone asked them the right way." Patricia stood, setting the cat aside. The cat expressed its opinion about this with a short, offended sound, and went to a shelf beside the fireplace. She pulled down a binder. It was heavy, the kind of binder you accumulated over years of saving things you weren't sure you'd need but couldn't bring yourself to throw away. She handed it to Nora. "I kept copies," Patricia said simply. "Not of everything, but enough." The next week operated on 2 tracks simultaneously, the way situations did when they were moving fast in a direction you couldn't fully control. On one track, Nora was unemployed. She filed for unemployment benefits. She updated her nursing license registration. She answered a recruiter's email about a position at a hospital in Cookville with a message that said she was weighing options, which was technically true. She ran in the mornings. She cooked actual meals instead of eating crackers over the sink. She called her sister twice, both times keeping the conversation to ordinary things. How her sister's kids were doing in school, whether their mother's hip was improving, the small texture of life that continued existing regardless of everything else. On the other track, she was in Conrad's office every other day. Sloan was methodical in the way that thorough people were methodical. She built the picture piece by piece, not rushing to conclusions before the evidence supported them. She interviewed Kira Strand by video call, a woman who'd left nursing entirely after her termination and was now working in pharmaceutical administration. Strand was quiet and precise when she talked about what had happened, with a specific composure of someone who'd processed a thing fully and landed somewhere past anger in the territory of clear-eyed account. Mateo Garza was harder to reach. He'd moved to Knoxville. When he finally called back, his voice had the wariness of someone who'd been down a road before that hadn't gone anywhere. "What's this for?" he asked. Because I've talked to a lawyer about this before. Nothing happened. We're not lawyers, Conrad told him. Then what are you? People who are going to make sure it doesn't get buried this time. A pause, a long one. What do you need from me? Bev Holden was different from the others. She'd been a charge nurse, 12 years at Callaway, and she answered her phone immediately and talked for 40 minutes straight without being prompted. She had documented everything, dates, names, specific incidents, with the thoroughness of someone who had always known, on some level, that she was going to need it. She had a folder on her laptop that she called the Holt file, and she said the name without hesitation, without lowering her voice. I've been waiting for someone to do something with this, she said. I was starting to think nobody was going to. The picture that assembled itself from all of it was not elegant. It was the opposite of elegant. It was the kind of complicated, overlapping institutional failure that didn't have a single dramatic moment at its center, but instead had years of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, none of them defensible in aggregate. Holt making clinical calls that were overconfident. Administration backing him because he generated revenue and managed complexity, and because holding him accountable would mean admitting the system had tolerated him. Nursing staff raising concerns that were reclassified, documented against, and eventually silenced not through dramatic confrontation, but through the grinding bureaucratic accumulation of needs, improvement ratings and conduct reports, and the quiet withdrawal of shift assignments until people decided it wasn't worth it anymore. Nora's case was the same pattern with one difference. She had actually been there when a man would have died, and the man she'd saved was Darren Okafor. She was at Conrad's office on a Wednesday afternoon, reviewing a timeline Sloan had assembled when Conrad got a call. She could tell from his side of it that it was short and specific, and that what he'd been told changed the shape of something. He hung up and looked at Sloan first, then at Nora. The board is meeting Friday, he said. Emergency session. Ferris has moved to formally ratify Holt's conduct report and enter it into the hospital's permanent clinical oversight record. Nora understood what that meant. A formal entry in the oversight record would make her termination a matter of documented clinical concern, not just a personnel decision, but a record that would follow her professional license. It would be searchable. It would appear in future credential reviews. It would make her hireable only by institutions willing to look past a patient safety flag, which was to say, very few of them. When did this come together? She asked. Probably when they realized you were talking to people. Conrad set his phone face down on the table. Someone at the hospital knows something is being built. I don't know who. She thought of Patricia Whaley. She thought of the binder on the shelf. She thought of the particular silence of a supply corridor. Can we stop it? She said. Not by Friday, Sloan said. She didn't soften it, which Nora appreciated. The board meeting is procedural. Even if we walk in there with everything we have right now, the institutional process will absorb it. They'll review, they'll deliberate, they'll table. Months. Then what do we do? Conrad looked at her. We don't stop Friday, he said. We make Friday irrelevant. She looked at him steadily. How? There's a compliance reporting channel, Sloan said. State Medical Board, Hospital Credentialing Authority, and, because of what Darren's situation involves, potentially a federal channel, depending on how the patient's background intersects with the incident. Nora went very still. What do you mean, Darren's background? Sloan and Conrad exchanged a look that was brief, but not brief enough. The accident wasn't an accident, Conrad said. She'd had a feeling. Not a specific one, more like the kind of ambient sense that comes from having spent years in environments where things were rarely what they appeared to be on the surface. She'd had it since the diner, since Okafor's hand had moved to his left side without him noticing, since Conrad had said people who know what you did in a tone that wasn't just about nursing. Tell me, she said. Darren Okafor had left Naval Intelligence 2 years ago, but he hadn't left the work entirely. He'd transitioned into private consulting. Specifically, he'd been engaged to assess a federal contract held by a defense logistics company called Varus Group, whose operations intersected with several government supply chains. 3 weeks before the accident, He'd submitted a preliminary finding to the contact who'd hired him, flagging what he believed were significant billing irregularities, the kind that, if substantiated, would represent federal contract fraud on a scale that didn't stay small. 4 days after submitting that finding, a car had run his motorcycle off Route 9 outside Harwick. The driver fled, Conrad said. No plates captured. Okafor thought it was road rage. He genuinely wasn't certain. He paused. He's more certain now. The room was very quiet. In the hospital, Nora said slowly, working it as she spoke. Holt! The board. We don't know yet, Sloan said. That's the honest answer. What we know is that Okafor was brought to Callaway specifically because it was the closest trauma center to where the accident happened. What we know is that the attending on call that night was Holt. What we know is that Holt cleared him for observation when his presentation warranted significantly more aggressive workup. She let that sit. That may be incompetence. It may be something else. We don't have evidence of the something else yet. Yet, Nora said. Yet. She sat back. Outside the window, the brick wall of the adjacent building had a crack running up it from the second floor, the kind of crack that started small and widened over years in a way nobody noticed until it was structural. She looked at it for a moment. So I'm not just someone who got fired for doing her job, she said. You are that, Conrad said. That's completely real, and we're not minimizing it. But yes, it's possible you're also the only reason that Darren Okafor is alive to tell anyone what he found. She thought about the moment she'd stood at his bedside with her hand on his abdomen and known, the way the knowing had been quiet and immediate and without drama. She thought about the fluorescent lights and the monitor lines and the specific quality of 3 a.m. in a hospital corridor. She thought about the part of her life she'd left. She hadn't left it behind, she understood now. She'd just put it down for a while. What do I need to do? She said. The Friday board meeting happened. Nora wasn't there. She was in Conrad's office with Sloan, watching a clock and going through documentation with the systematic attention of someone who'd learned to prepare for operations with more variables than control. The formal ratification of Holt's conduct report went through at 10:47 a.m. Gerald Ferris sent a courtesy notification to Nora's personal email at 11:15, the kind of notification that was legally required and emotionally weaponized, phrased to communicate finality. She read it once, closed the email, and went back to the documents. At 12:30, Sloan filed the complaint package, 340 pages of documentation, with the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners, the Joint Commission's Complaint Division, and a federal whistleblower channel that she submitted under Okafor's authorization, not Nora's, which was the channel that mattered most given what Darren had found and what Conrad now believed had been done because of it. How long does a federal channel take? Nora asked. Depends on what they find when they start pulling threads, Conrad said. Could be weeks, could be faster if there are active investigations that this connects to. And in the meantime, the conduct report is in my file. Yes. She nodded. She'd expected that answer. She was getting used to the shape of this. The understanding that doing the right thing and the right thing immediately resolving itself were two different timelines that didn't always meet. She went home that afternoon and made dinner and watched the light change on the wall of her apartment and tried not to think about the fact that her nursing license was currently shadowed by a document that said she was a patient safety risk, and that until something externally changed that, she was functionally unemployable in the field she'd come back into the world to work in. She was doing okay at not thinking about it. Then her phone buzzed, a text from an unlisted number. Not Conrad's. She had his saved. Not Sloan's. Not Darren's. We need to meet. Not through Briggs. I work at Callaway. I have something you don't know about yet. She stared at the screen. How do I know this isn't Holt? She typed back. The response came in under 30 seconds. Because what I have is about Holt. And if he finds out I talked to you, I'm done. She read the message twice. She thought about Conrad. She thought about Sloan's timeline. She thought about the 3 nurses who'd been pushed out before her, each one thinking they were alone in it. She typed, where and when. The response? Tomorrow. 7 a.m., Kellerman Park. The east entrance. Come alone. She set the phone down on the table. The cat. She didn't have a cat. She didn't have anything in this apartment that hadn't been placed there deliberately and minimally. But if she did, it would have been on the bookshelf, looking at her with the specific dispassion of something that had already decided what was going to happen next. She picked the phone back up and looked at the message again. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. She thought about what Sloan had said. It's possible you're also the only reason that Darren Okafor is alive. And she thought about something else, something she hadn't said aloud to anyone, something she carried in the part of herself that she'd tried to put down and discovered she couldn't. In the life she'd left, people had come to her with messages exactly like this one, in exactly this tone, with exactly this level of urgency and exactly this request for secrecy. Sometimes those messages were exactly what they appeared to be, and sometimes they were the thing that happened right before everything got significantly more dangerous. She set her alarm for 5:30 and went to bed. She was at Kellerman Park at 6:53. Not because she was anxious, because arriving early to an unknown meeting at an unfamiliar person's request was the kind of habit that had kept her alive in places where arriving late wasn't a recoverable mistake. She came in from the west entrance, not the east, and walked the interior perimeter of the park first, a habit so old she didn't think about it anymore, the way other people didn't think about checking both ways before crossing a street. Benches, sight lines, exit points, anyone already positioned, a woman walking a dog, two men on a bench with coffee cups talking, a jogger moving counterclockwise around the path. She found a position near a tree line with a clear view of the east entrance and waited. At 6:58, a car parked on the street outside the east gate. Nobody got out for 2 minutes. Then the driver's door opened and a woman climbed out. Mid-30s, dark coat, moving with the particular tension of someone who had not slept and was using forward momentum to compensate. She came through the gate and stopped, looking around with the naked uncertainty of someone who didn't do this kind of thing. Nora stepped out of the tree line and crossed the grass toward her. The woman saw her and something in her posture shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a specific kind of dread, replaced by a different kind. "Nora Voss," she said. "Yes." "I'm Renata Solis. I'm a pharmacist at Callaway." She said it quickly, like she'd been rehearsing the first sentence and needed to get through it before she lost her nerve. "I need you to know that I thought about not coming. I almost didn't." "I know," Nora said. "Tell me why you did." Renata looked at the ground for a moment. She was holding her phone in both hands, fingers wrapped around it the way people held things when they needed something to hold. "Because I've been sitting on something for 4 months, and I think I was waiting for someone to give me a reason." "What did you find?" Renata looked up. "Medication administration records," she said. "Specifically, the records from the night Darren Okafor was admitted." Nora kept her face neutral. "What about them?" "There was an order entered at 2:17 a.m., a sedation order, low dose, the kind that wouldn't register as dramatic on monitoring but would blunt a patient's presentation, slow the reflexes, suppress the pain response, make someone look more stable than they actually were." Renata swallowed. "The order was entered under Holt's credentials. That's not necessarily unusual for a trauma patient. It's unusual when the patient hasn't been told, when the sedation isn't documented in the nursing notes. When it's entered at 2:17 a.m. and there's no corresponding entry in Holt's physician notes for that time." She pulled up something on her phone. "I was doing a routine medication reconciliation the following week. It's part of pharmacy protocol. We review admin records for any discrepancies. I found it then. I flagged it internally." "What happened when you flagged it?" "My supervisor told me it was a documentation error, that it would be corrected." She held the phone out. "It was corrected. The record was amended. The order was changed to show it was entered at a different time with a different notation." She paused. "But I had already printed the original." Nora looked at the phone. On the screen was a photograph of a printed medication administration record. Timestamp, drug name, dosage, the credentials of the ordering physician, 2:17 a.m. She looked at it long enough to understand what she was looking at. Then she looked at Renata. "Why didn't you go to the Board of Pharmacy?" she asked. "Because the amendment was already in the system. Because my supervisor told me it was a documentation error. Because—" Renata's voice caught just slightly, and she pulled it back. "Because I have a daughter, I have a mortgage, and I watched what happened to the nurses who pushed back against Holt. I watched what happened to you." You watched what happened to me and you still came here. I watched what happened to you and I decided I didn't want to be someone who watched anymore. She said it plainly, without inflation, which was what made it land. Nora looked at the medication record again. 2:17 a.m. She had started her shift at 2 a.m. She had gone to Darren Okafor's room first because of the handoff note from Jamie Reyes. She'd assessed him, paged Holt at approximately 2:45. Holt had entered a sedation order at 2:17. 28 minutes before she called him. He hadn't ordered sedation in response to her call. He'd ordered it before her call, before she'd even assessed the patient, which meant he'd either been in the system already, watching the admission, or he'd been alerted before she paged him by someone who had. A sedation order that would have made Darren Okafor look more stable than he was. That would have reduced the urgency. That, combined with Holt's dismissal of her concerns, might have been enough to delay intervention past the point of no return. She stood in the cold morning air of Kellerman Park and turned that over very carefully, the way you turn something over when you needed to see all of its sides before you decided what it was. I need the original printout, she said. I have it at home. Can you get it to me today? Renata nodded. I brought it. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Her hand was not entirely steady. Not. She called Conrad from the car before she'd even left the park's parking area. He picked up in 2 rings. How bad? He said, because he could apparently read the temperature of a call from the first syllable. Worse than we thought, she said. I need Sloan, and I need Darren. What happened? Not on the phone. A pause. 40 minutes. I'll be there. She drove with the envelope on the passenger seat and the particular internal stillness that came when a situation stopped being about one thing and became about something much larger. She'd felt this before. The moment when the scope of an operation shifted, when what you'd thought was a contained problem revealed itself to have walls that went further back than you'd measured. It wasn't panic, it wasn't even dread. It was the recalibration of a person who'd been trained to adapt quickly to changed parameters, who knew that the thing you prepared for was rarely the exact shape of the thing that arrived. She'd prepared for a wrongful termination. What she was driving toward was something that touched federal fraud, potential deliberate patient endangerment, and a cover-up that had been amended directly into the hospital's own records. Conrad looked at the medication printout for a long time without speaking. Sloan looked at it and then looked at the timestamp and then looked at Nora. 2:17, she said, before I paged him, before anyone had formally escalated Okafor's status. Darren Okafor was there, seated at the table in Conrad's office. He'd come in a dark jacket, still moving carefully, but with more ease than 2 weeks ago. He looked at the printout when Sloan set it down in front of him. His expression didn't change dramatically. It did the thing experienced people's expressions did when they received information they'd been half prepared for, which was to settle rather than react. He had access to the admission log, Darren said. It wasn't a question. Or someone told him you were there, Conrad said. Someone with access to the incoming patient log. The admissions desk runs a separate system, Sloan said. Real-time intake. It's accessible to attending physicians. Holt could have had an alert set, or he could have been checking. Or someone called him, Nora said. The room sat with that for a moment. This changes the complaint filing, Sloan said. She pulled the laptop toward her. What we submitted Friday was based on clinical negligence and institutional misconduct. That's still accurate. But this, she tapped the printout, this is not negligence. If the record was amended and the original order was what this printout shows, then we're looking at deliberate falsification of medical records. Combined with Darren's situation and the timing, it becomes something federal, Conrad said. It's already something federal, Darren said quietly. It's been something federal since someone ran me off Route 9. He looked at Conrad. How fast can we get this to the right channel? I made a call this morning before you arrived, Conrad said. There's someone I know at the Nashville field office. He's been aware of the Varus Group inquiry at the periphery, not leading it, but aware. When I told him what we had, he told me to gather everything physical we had and to not submit anything else digitally until I'd talked to him. Why? Nora asked. Because if there's active federal interest in Varus Group and someone connected to that inquiry was almost killed at the same time his findings were due, The last thing anyone wants is for the documentation to move through channels that can be watched. They can watch our submissions, Sloan said. If someone at Callaway knows we filed Friday, then they've already started thinking about how to respond. Conrad looked at each of them in turn. We need to move faster than their response. The next 48 hours had the quality of things that were moving too fast to fully feel while they were happening. Nora had known that quality before, had known it in long operational stretches where the only option was to stay functional and sort through what it meant later when there was time and a safe place to do it. She didn't have that kind of distance now. She was inside it. Sloan worked through the night on the supplemental complaint package, the original medication record, Renata Solis's written account, the timeline of the record amendment, cross-referenced against Holt's physician login timestamps from the night of Okafor's admission. Patricia had pulled those logs from the system before her own access was reviewed, which Nora found out about on Saturday morning when Patricia texted her a photograph of a printed page that showed Marcus Holt had logged into the hospital's clinical system at 2:09 a.m. on the night in question, 8 minutes before the sedation order, when she hadn't yet paged him, when there was no documented clinical reason for him to be in the system reviewing that patient's record. He'd been watching. She sat with that for 3 full minutes before she typed back to Patricia. Thank you. Please stay away from the system now. Don't pull anything else. Patricia's response, already done. You okay? She thought about the question. Working on it, she typed. Conrad's contact at the Nashville field office, whose name Conrad did not share and Nora did not ask for, arranged a secure drop of the physical documentation on Sunday. Nora drove it herself in a rental car, taking a route Conrad specified that made no obvious sense until she understood it was the route that avoided the 2 traffic camera corridors between Harwick and Nashville. She drove it in 3 hours, transferred the envelope at a gas station off the highway without any of the drama that transfer points had in movies. Just a man in a gray jacket who took the envelope without making eye contact and walked to a different car, and drove back. She stopped at a rest area on the way home and sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes, eating a gas station sandwich that tasted like nothing, and watching trucks pass on the highway and letting herself feel the full weight of what this had become. She had come back into the world to be a nurse. She had come back because she thought a hospital was a controlled environment, because she'd believed that what she carried from before, the ability to stay calm, to read critical situations, to make fast decisions under pressure, could be applied to something that didn't have the other costs, the other weight. She had been wrong about what she was walking back into, even if she'd been right about what she could do. She ate the last of the sandwich and drove back to Harwick. Monday morning, the call came at 7:41, while she was on her second cup of coffee and reviewing the timeline she'd been maintaining on her laptop, a chronological document that had started as notes and was now 12 pages long. It was Renata Solis, and she was not calm. Someone came to the pharmacy, she said. Her voice had the texture of someone who was trying to keep it even and only partially succeeding. This morning, before I got in, my supervisor pulled me into her office and said there had been an audit flag on the medication record I'd reviewed in October. She said it looked like I had printed confidential patient documentation without authorization. Did you use your own credentials to access the record? It was a routine reconciliation review. I was completely authorized. Then the print authorization would be logged the same way. That's what I told her. A pause. She said the flag had come from risk management. Nora, risk management doesn't flag pharmacy reconciliation reviews. That's not their process. Who's in risk management? It reports directly to Gerald Ferris. She closed her laptop. Renata, listen to me. Don't access anything else in the system. Don't print anything. Don't discuss this with anyone at the hospital, including your supervisor. If they push you formally, say you want union representation before you answer questions. I'm not in the union. Then say you want to consult legal counsel. Say anything that buys you time without putting more in writing. She paused. Did they take anything from you? No, it was a conversation. My supervisor looked uncomfortable the whole time. I don't think she wanted to be having it. That meant it had come from above Patricia's supervisor's pay grade. Ferris, or someone near Ferris, had looked at what Renata had touched 4 months ago and decided it was a thread worth pulling. which meant someone had looked at what the pharmacy records contained and understood what it showed, which meant someone at Callaway was already doing damage control. She called Conrad immediately after. He picked up. "They know," she said. "How far?" "Far enough to start coming at the witnesses." She told him about Renata. When she finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds, which was a long time for Conrad. "The Nashville contact told me this morning they've opened a preliminary inquiry," he said. "It's not formal yet, but it's opened. That means they're going to start gathering from their end, which means we have a window," she said. "A short one. Before the hospital's legal team gets organized, before they start counseling Holt on what not to say, before the board realizes the shape of what's coming." He paused. "There's something else. The Varus Group, the company Darren was investigating. The Nashville contact asked me specifically about the company's connection to Harwick, whether there was any regional relationship." "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet, but Darren might." Darren Okafor knew. He came to Conrad's office that afternoon and he laid it out the way intelligence people laid things out. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion, just factually, in sequence, in the way that allowed other people to follow the logic. Varus Group held a federal logistics contract that involved medical supply distribution, specifically distribution to federally affiliated medical facilities and certain contractors. One of the regional distribution nodes was in Clarksville, 40 minutes from Harwick. Callaway Regional was not a federal facility, but its board had 3 members who also sat on the board of a private investment group that held a minority stake in the Clarksville node. "Board members," Conrad said. "2 of whom were in the room when Nora's termination was ratified," Darren said. The room went quiet. Nora looked at the table. She thought about Gerald Ferris and his 2 large suits and his institutional loyalty. She thought about the board meeting she hadn't attended, where her conduct report had been formally entered into the clinical oversight record at 10:47 a.m. while she sat 20 minutes away going through documents. "They weren't protecting Holt," she said. "Holt is a mechanism," Darren said, "a useful one, a surgeon who does what he's told in exchange for insulation from accountability. They were protecting the relationship." To Varus Group. "If my findings had moved forward, if I'd been able to submit a substantiated report through the right channel, the contract review would have triggered an audit. An audit of the Clarksville node would have exposed the board members' conflict of interest, which would have exposed the contract itself to cancellation." He paused. "I was inconvenient. The most efficient solution was to make me not around to be inconvenient." She thought about Route 9, about a car with no plates that had run him off the road and kept going. "And when I saved you," she said slowly, "I became inconvenient too. When you saved me and then wouldn't be silent about what Holt had done to you, yes." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know any of this was going to touch you." "You were bleeding into your abdomen," she said. "You didn't owe me a briefing." Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite a smile. "No, but I owe you the truth now." She nodded. She looked at Conrad. "How long does the federal window stay open?" "My contact said to expect movement within 72 hours on their end. Either they open formally or they refer it out." He met her gaze. "Either way, once it's formally opened, the hospital will find out. Their legal team will know before the end of the day. They'll move to protect records, counsel board members, and..." Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't have saved. Harwick area code. She answered it. "Nora Voss." A man's voice, not someone she recognized, even careful with the slight formality of someone who was choosing their words while they spoke. "Who is this?" "My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm Marcus Holt's attorney." A pause. "I'm calling because my client would like to offer you a resolution. Something that removes the conduct notation from your file and provides compensation in exchange for a mutual non-disclosure agreement covering the events of your employment at Callaway Regional." She looked at Conrad, who was watching her face. "When did your client authorize this call?" she asked. "This morning." "What prompted him to do that this morning, specifically?" A brief pause. Brief enough that she'd have missed it if she hadn't been listening for it. My client has been considering the reputational implications of a prolonged dispute and believes a private resolution is in everyone's interest. I'll call you back, she said. Ms. Voss, I'd encourage you to... I'll call you back, she said again, and ended the call. Conrad was already leaning forward. Holt's lawyer. Offering settlement and NDA. She set the phone on the table. This morning, after Renata was called in, after whatever Ferris's risk management team found when they started pulling pharmacy records. They're not protecting Holt, Sloan said from behind her laptop. They're trying to contain him. If he settles with you quietly, your documentation stays private, our submissions lose their central witness, and the whole thing gets smaller. They think I'm the thread they need to cut, Nora said. You are, Darren said. Without your account and your records, the pharmacy documentation is an anomaly, an administrative error. Without the pattern of what Holt did to other nurses, the complaint is one incident. Without you, the story doesn't hold its shape. She thought about Kira Strand, who had left nursing entirely. Mateo Garza, who'd talked to a lawyer and gotten nowhere. Bev Holden, who'd been keeping a folder on her laptop for 18 months and had started to think nobody was going to do anything. She thought about Patricia Whaley's face in a supply corridor, handing her a notice and not quite meeting her eyes. She thought about the man in the fluorescent-lit room who had said patient outcome notwithstanding in the tone of someone who had decided the outcome wasn't the point. She looked at Conrad. The federal window is 72 hours. Yes. What's the fastest way to ensure it doesn't close? Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There's a person who can accelerate it. Someone was standing to make a direct request for formal review escalation. Someone whose name on a request carries institutional weight that mine doesn't. He paused. But he's been staying out of this deliberately because of his position. Darren, she said. Darren Okafor sat very still. He was looking at his hands on the table. She watched him work through it, watched the calculation, the weighing of it, the thing people did when they were deciding whether to put themselves in a position that could cost them. If I make that request formally, he said, the people who ran me off Route 9 will know I'm not backing down. I know, she said, and they'll know what I have. Yes. He looked up. His face had settled into something resolute and tired in equal measure. I haven't been backing down, he said. I've just been recovering. He picked up his own phone and dialed a number from memory, which told her it was a number he'd been carrying without writing down, the way you carried certain numbers when you didn't want them in any system. It's Okafor, he said when it picked up. His voice had shifted, something in it that was older, more compressed, the voice he'd had before he'd been a man recovering from surgery in a diner. I need to escalate. Yes, today. A pause. All of it. I'm ready. He hung up. Outside Conrad's office, the building made the small sounds that buildings made in the afternoon. An elevator somewhere, a door, the distant groan of the HVAC adjusting to the outdoor temperature as it changed. Ordinary building sounds. The ordinary sounds of a place where things were happening that would look different in a month than they did right now. How long? Nora asked. He said he'd make contact by end of day, Darren said. She nodded. She picked up her phone. She looked at Daniel Rourke's number. She thought about what it would mean to call back. Not to accept, but to stall, to buy time, to keep Holt's team thinking there was a negotiation happening while the window stayed open. She was still looking at the phone when Sloane's laptop made a sound. The specific sound of an incoming email that Sloane had set as a priority alert. Sloane looked at the screen. Her expression did the thing expressions did when new information arrived that was not what you'd been expecting. What? Conrad said. The Joint Commission, Sloane said. The complaint we filed Friday. She turned the laptop toward them. They flagged it for immediate review, not standard processing, immediate. She looked up. They want a representative from Callaway Regional available for an on-site interview by end of this week. Nora looked at the email. The formal language of institutional process, the carefully structured sentences that meant the machine had started moving and was not going to stop just because someone called a lawyer. Holt's attorney called this morning, she said. Yes, Conrad said. He was looking at the email with the expression of someone doing rapid calculation. He called because someone at the hospital was already watching the complaint submission and saw the flag come through. Which means they know the Joint Commission is moving, Sloan said, which means the settlement offer isn't about making this smaller. She looked at Nora. It's about stopping something that's already started. Outside, a vehicle pulled up in front of the building. She heard it without seeing it, the engine, the particular sound of a heavier vehicle than a standard car. She didn't know why she noticed it. She noticed a lot of things without choosing to. Then Conrad's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed, slightly but perceptibly, in the way faces changed when something shifted into a register that was serious. He answered it, listened for 10 seconds, said, "When?" and listened again. When he hung up, he looked at Nora. "The federal inquiry opened," he said, "an hour ago, formally. They're calling it an investigation now." He paused. "And they want you. Not just your documentation. They want you in Nashville tomorrow morning, in person." She looked at him steadily. "There's something else," he said. "They found something during the preliminary review, something in the Varis Group contract records that connects to Callaway's board." He paused, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Conrad Briggs looked like someone who was genuinely uncertain about the size of what he was holding. "There's a second patient, Nora, not Darren. Someone else who came through Callaway 6 months ago. Naval background, classified affiliation." He set his phone on the table. "They didn't make it." The room was absolutely still. She sat with that for a long moment. The weight of it, the specific terrible shape of it. That this had not started with her. That Darren had not been the first. That somewhere in the preceding 6 months, a person had come through those same doors and had not walked out. "Who was it?" she said. "That's what they need to tell you in person," Conrad said. She looked at the table. She looked at the medication printout still lying there, at Darren Okafor's name in the top corner of it, at the timestamp that said 2:17 a.m. She thought about the night she'd stood at a bedside with her hand on a man's abdomen and known. The knowing that had been quiet and immediate and without hesitation. She thought about all the nights she hadn't been there. "What time?" she said. 7 a.m., Conrad said. She nodded. She picked up her phone, and Holt's attorney's number was still on the screen, and she looked at it for one moment, and then she called it back. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice entirely level. "Tell your client I'm declining the offer." A pause. "Ms. Voss, I'd strongly encourage you to tell him something else," she said. "Tell him the Joint Commission called this afternoon. Tell him I'm in Nashville tomorrow morning." She paused. "And tell him that if he has anything he wants to say in his own words, he should probably say it before Friday, because after Friday, the people asking questions won't be me." She ended the call. Conrad looked at her. "Too much?" she asked. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "No," he said. "Write 'em out." She stood and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and for just a moment she felt the full distance between who she'd been trying to be for the past 9 months and who she actually was. The distance between a quiet nurse who stayed late and accepted extra shifts and cleaned up other people's mistakes, and the person who'd existed before that, who'd learned in conditions she didn't talk about. That silence was only ever a strategy and not a permanent state. She'd been quiet long enough. She put on her jacket, said goodnight to the room, and walked out into the hallway where the building made its ordinary sounds around her, and her phone was already in her hand, and Nashville was 7 hours away, and somewhere in that city a federal inquiry had opened an hour ago with her name somewhere in the first paragraph of the request. Tomorrow it would be her voice in that room. Tonight, she drove home, made dinner, and sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long time, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that the thing she was walking into tomorrow was the kind of thing that changed the shape of what came after, and she wanted to enter it with her eyes open and her hands steady and nothing left behind that she hadn't decided to leave. Her alarm was still set for 5:30. She went to bed and slept and did not dream. She was on the road by 5:58. The highway out of Harwick was mostly empty at that hour. Trucks running their overnight loads, a few early commuters with their headlights cutting through the gray pre-dawn. She drove with the radio off and the heater on low, and the kind of focus that came naturally to her in the hours before something important, the way other people got nervous and she got quiet. The Nashville field office was in a federal building downtown, unremarkable from the outside in the deliberate way that federal buildings often were, designed to look like nothing particular was happening inside. She found parking 2 blocks away and walked in with 7 minutes to spare, which was the amount of time she liked to have before anything. A woman met her in the lobby. Early 40s, dark suit, the kind of composure that came from doing this work long enough to have learned that composure was cheaper than reactivity. She introduced herself as Special Agent Vera Mack. "Thank you for coming in," Mack said, in a tone that suggested she didn't usually thank people for things. "You said in person," Nora said. "I came." Mack looked at her for a moment with the evaluating quality of someone making a quick and fairly accurate assessment. "Come upstairs." The room they put her in was a conference room on the 4th floor with a view of the street below and a table with a water pitcher and 3 chairs. Mack sat across from her. A second agent sat at the end of the table with a laptop and a recorder, which Mack identified, stated the date and time for, and then sat between them without ceremony. "You understand this is a voluntary interview," Mack said. "Yes." "You're not a subject of the investigation." "I know." "Okay." Mack opened a folder. "I want to ask you about the night of the 14th. I know you've documented it extensively. I want to hear it from you directly, in your own words, starting from when you came on shift." She told it. She told it the way she'd written it, the way she'd described it to Conrad and Sloan, the way she'd described it to anyone who'd asked, chronologically, specifically, without embellishment. The handoff from Reyes, Okafor's presentation, her assessment, the page to Holt, his response, the repeat labs, the decision she'd made. Mack listened without interrupting. The second agent typed. When she finished, Mack said, "The sedation order, 2:17 a.m. You didn't know about it that night?" "No. If I had, it would have changed my clinical picture significantly. A patient presenting with the symptoms Okafor had, who was also sedated, could look more stable on surface observation than he actually was. The sedation would have masked the pain response he was using to communicate his deterioration. In your opinion, was that the intent?" She looked at Mack steadily. "I'm a nurse. You're asking me to assess intent. I'm asking for your clinical opinion about whether the order, given the circumstances and timing, was consistent with standard patient care." "No," she said, "it wasn't consistent with standard patient care. It was entered before any escalation, before the patient had been reevaluated, and it wasn't documented in the nursing notes. In standard care, a sedation order in a monitored trauma patient would be accompanied by clear documentation and nursing notification. And there was no nursing notification. None." Mack made a note. She turned a page in the folder. "I want to tell you something now, and I want you to understand that I'm telling you because your account is relevant to what I'm about to describe." She paused briefly, as if organizing the weight of the information before setting it down. 6 months ago, a patient was admitted to Callaway Regional Medical Center. The admission came through the emergency department at 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday. The patient had been in a vehicle collision on Route 17, approximately 12 miles from Harwick. Nora kept her eyes on Mack's face. The patient's name was Thomas Weller, 44 years old, former Navy, attached to a signals intelligence unit for 11 years. He had been, for approximately 4 months prior to his death, working peripherally with the same federal inquiry that Darren Okafor's findings were submitted to. Mack looked at her. He died at Callaway Regional at 3:47 a.m. The official cause was listed as traumatic brain injury secondary to the collision. What's the unofficial cause? That's what we're looking at. Mack set a photograph on the table. It showed a page of medical records, similar to the pharmacy printout Nora had brought, but from a physician's record. Thomas Weller received 2 medication administrations in the 4 hours he was at Callaway that were not standard TBY protocol. Both were entered under attending credentials. Both were administered during the period when his GCS was documented as declining. She paused. The attending on call that night was Marcus Holt. The room was very quiet. She looked at the records on the table. She looked at the timestamps. She did the clinical calculation the same way she always did it, without drama, because the numbers were either consistent with appropriate care or they weren't, and these weren't. "Who else was on board at Callaway during Weller's admission?" she asked. Mac looked at her. Gerald Ferris authorized the after-hours attending assignment. He was the administrator on call that night. She sat back. 2 patients, 6 months apart, both with federal connections, both assigned to Holt, both with medication records that didn't match standard care. One dead, one alive, because a nurse on a night shift had put her hand on his abdomen and known. She thought about Darren Okafor sitting in Conrad's office 3 days ago, his hand moving to his left side. "I'm sorry, I didn't know any of this was going to touch you." She thought about the fluorescent lights, about patient outcome notwithstanding, about Gerald Ferris and his 2 large suits. "What do you need from me?" she said. What they needed was 3 hours of it. They went through every shift she'd worked at Callaway in 9 months, looking for patterns, patients with unusual presentations, medication anomalies and chart notes she'd documented, anything she'd flagged internally that had been reclassified. She answered everything she remembered, and what she didn't remember, she said she didn't remember, which Mac seemed to appreciate more than the things she did. At one point, Mac's phone rang. She looked at the screen, excused herself, and was out of the room for 6 minutes. When she came back, something in her posture had changed slightly but perceptibly, the change of someone who had received information that moved things. "We've been authorized to issue a preservation order to Callaway Regional," Mac said, sitting back down. "Effective immediately. They'll receive formal notification within the hour. All clinical records, administrative correspondence, and board communications from the past 2 years are to be preserved and made available for federal review." "Will they know who initiated the inquiry?" "They'll receive a formal federal document. They'll draw their own conclusions." She looked at Nora. "I want you to know that the investigation would have opened based on Okafor's materials alone. What you provided, the pharmacy record, the documentation pattern, the witness accounts from the other nurses, that gave us the clinical framework that contextualizes everything else." "Holt is a mechanism," Nora said, repeating what Darren had said. "Not the source." Mac considered that. "That's accurate, but mechanisms have to be accountable too." She left Nashville at 11:47 a.m. and drove back to Harwick in heavy traffic with a different kind of stillness than she'd had on the way down. Not the stillness of preparation, the stillness of something that had been set in motion and could not be recalled. Conrad had 2 calls waiting for her when she arrived at his office. The first was from Sloan, who told her that Patricia Whaley had been approached by Callaway's legal team that morning, asked to come in for a meeting about her recent system access. Patricia had said she needed to consult her own attorney first, which she had apparently said with the particular authority of a woman who had been at that hospital for 19 years and was no longer in any mood to be managed. "She called Bev Holden after," Sloan said, "and Kira Strand. I think she's been making calls all morning." The second call was from Darren Okafor, who told Conrad, and Conrad relayed to Nora, that his federal contact had confirmed the Varus Group's primary contract officer had been interviewed the previous week before the inquiry formally opened, as part of an independent audit that had been running parallel to Darren's inquiry. The audit had found what Darren had found, and had found it from a different direction entirely, which was the kind of corroboration that made cases. "The board members," Nora said. "2 of them have already retained outside counsel," Conrad said, "as of this morning." She thought about that. The specific speed of it, 2 board members calling lawyers in the same morning that a federal preservation order landed at the hospital. The speed of people who'd been watching for the wave and had been hoping it wouldn't reach them, and had now seen that it had. "What about Holt?" she asked. "Nothing yet. He thinks the settlement offer is still on the table." "Let him think it," Conrad said. The preservation order hit Callaway Regional at 12:53 p.m. She knew the approximate time because Patricia Whaley texted her at 1:07. "Federal notice just arrived. Whole floor is quiet. Ferris has been in his office with the door closed since noon. I think they knew it was coming." She was sitting at Conrad's table eating a sandwich, an actual sandwich from the place on Kellner Street, not a gas station version, when the text came through. She read it and passed the phone to Sloan without comment. Sloan read it and looked up. They knew. Someone told them, Conrad said. Holt's attorney, probably, when Nora called him back last night. Does that matter? Nora asked. Not anymore, Sloan said. A preservation order means they can't touch anything. Whatever's in the system is in the system now. Every login, every amendment, every deleted record that left a system trace. She looked at the table. The record amendment Renata found, the one that changed the timestamp on the sedation order, that's going to leave a trace in the administrative log. They altered it from inside the system, Nora said. Yes. And the administrative log shows who was logged in when an amendment was made. It's not something you can delete without creating another log entry. Sloan almost smiled, not quite. It's the kind of thing that looks like a clean cover-up until someone who knows the system looks at the underlying architecture. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone gray. Low cloud cover that flattened the light and made the brick wall of the adjacent building look older than it was. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and someone answered it. The sound of things continuing, the world not pausing for the specific gravity of this room and what was being assembled in it. She thought about Thomas Weller, 44 years old, 11 years in Naval Signals Intelligence, dead at 3:47 a.m. in a hospital room while his medical records were being written in a way that obscured what had happened to him. Is there family? She asked. Conrad looked at her. Weller? Yes. A sister in Memphis. Mac's team is handling notification. She nodded. She picked up her sandwich and looked at it and put it back down. She thought about the sister in Memphis who was going to get a phone call she hadn't prepared for, about a brother who had died 6 months ago for reasons she'd been told were straightforward and were not. The human cost of it had been sitting at the edge of everything since Mac had set that photograph on the table, and she'd been keeping it there, at the edge, because you couldn't do this work while you were fully in the feeling of it. She'd learned that in a different context. It was true here, too. Later, she thought, later you can sit with what Thomas Weller means. Right now there was still work. The Joint Commission team arrived in Harwick on Thursday. They came quietly, no announcement, no press notification. 2 representatives who checked into a hotel on the east side of the city and presented themselves at Callaway Regional's administrative entrance at 8 a.m. with credentials and a formal notice that granted them immediate access to personnel records, clinical documentation, and administrative correspondence. She knew they'd arrived because Bev Holden texted the group. There was a group now, a text chain that included Patricia, Bev, Kira Strand, and Mateo Garza, and it had the particular energy of people who'd been isolated in the same experience for years and had only recently discovered the others existed. They're here, Bev wrote at 8:14. 3 people just walked past pharmacy, suits and badges. Ferris came down to meet them, and he looked like he'd been up all night. Patricia. Holt hasn't come in yet. He was scheduled for 7:30. Kira Strand, typing from Cookville. Call me when something happens. I'll have my phone. She was in her apartment when the text came through. She'd stopped going to Conrad's office every day. Not because there was less to do, but because the machine was running now and there were hours in it that she didn't need to fill with her presence. She'd learned to identify those hours and use them, because the alternative was to keep moving just to feel like she was contributing, and that kind of motion was expensive and produced less than it appeared to. She ran in the morning. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with the chronological document she'd been maintaining and read through it from the beginning, not looking for new information but checking the shape of it, whether it held together, whether the sequence was what it was and not what she'd wanted it to be. It held together. Holt arrived at Callaway Regional at 9:43 a.m. She knew because Patricia texted, "He's here." They took him directly to conference room 2. His attorney is already there. She looked at her phone for a moment. She thought about conference room 2 on the 4th floor with its view of the parking structure and its long table and its 5 chairs. She thought about the last time she'd sat in a room like that, on the other side of the table from people who had already decided what the story was. She thought about the version of Marcus Holt who had sat across from her with folded hands and steady eyes and spoken about patient safety with the authority of a man who had never once considered that the machine protecting him might stop. She hoped, with a clarity that surprised her by being completely uncomplicated, that the room felt different on that side of the table. By Friday afternoon, the shape of things had become visible in the way that shapes became visible when enough of the surrounding material was removed. Sloan got it from a source she didn't name. Someone inside the Joint Commission review process, who was not supposed to be talking, but was apparently doing so anyway, carefully and in limited amounts. What she got was this. The clinical record audit had identified 11 cases over a 3-year period in which documentation anomalies were present in Holt's patient charts. Of the 11, 4 involved patients with known federal affiliations. Of those 4, 2 had experienced outcomes that were significantly worse than their presentation warranted. Thomas Weller was one of them. The other had survived, but had suffered complications that had required extended hospitalization and had left permanent neurological consequences. The medication administration logs from all 4 cases contained the same pattern: orders entered under Holt's credentials at non-standard times, with no corresponding nursing notification, and with subsequent amendments that altered the documentation. The amendments had all been made from the same administrative terminal, a terminal located in Gerald Ferris's office. She was at Conrad's office when Sloan laid this out, and the room sat with it in the particular way rooms sat with things that were large enough to take a moment to fully receive. Ferris, Conrad said. His office. His access credentials. Whether he was physically there or whether his credentials were used by someone else. It's his office, Nora said. Yes. She thought about Gerald Ferris authorizing the after-hours attending assignment on the night Thomas Weller died. She thought about Gerald Ferris in the conference room saying patient outcome notwithstanding. She thought about the 2 board members who had retained counsel the same morning the preservation order arrived. She thought about the investment group, the Clarksville Node, the stake in a federal contract that would have been exposed if Darren Okafor's findings had moved forward. She thought about what it cost to protect something like that. Thomas Weller had cost them one thing. Darren Okafor had almost cost them another. And she had been the variable they hadn't planned for. Ferris is cooperating with the Joint Commission, Sloan said, or appearing to. His attorney is present for all interviews. She paused. He filed a formal request this morning to have Holt's conduct report on Nora suspended pending review. Nora looked at her. He filed to suspend it. Yes, not to withdraw it. No. Suspended pending review, which is administrative language for we're not ready to formally admit this was wrong yet, but we're also not going to defend it under current scrutiny. She understood the distinction exactly. It was the institutional version of stepping back without stepping down, creating space between yourself and the thing you'd done without accepting that you'd done it. He'll try to make Holt the terminus, she said. Concentrate everything on Holt, position himself as someone who was misled by his own department head. Probably, Conrad said. Whether that works depends on what's in the amendment logs and whether his credential activity can be separated from Holt's decisions, or whether it shows he was running parallel to them. It won't separate cleanly, she said. Someone had to be in the system amending records. Someone with administrative access. A surgeon doesn't have administrative override access. Holt could enter orders under his clinical credentials. He couldn't amend records in the administrative log. Sloan looked at her. Mac knows that. Then Ferris has a problem that a cooperation posture isn't going to solve. Saturday brought 2 things. The first was a call from Daniel Rourke, Holt's attorney, at 8:51 a.m. The call was brief. Rourke said that the previous settlement offer had been withdrawn and that his client would have no further direct or indirect communication with Nora through counsel. He said it in the clipped voice of an attorney who was managing a situation that had grown substantially past what he'd been retained to handle. She said, "Thank you for letting me know," and ended the call and stood in her kitchen for a moment with the coffee she'd just poured. The settlement offer withdrawn meant Holt was no longer trying to close a door. It meant someone had told him the door was already off its hinges. The second thing was a text from Bev Holden at 2:14 p.m. Turn on the news. She didn't own a television. She opened her laptop and found a local Harwick news station's live stream, already 8 minutes into a segment. A reporter was standing outside Callaway Regional Medical Center with a microphone, and behind her the hospital's main entrance was visible with the particular institutional composure of a building trying to look like nothing unusual was happening inside. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Callaway Regional Medical Center under Federal and Joint Commission review. Sources say multiple staff under investigation. The reporter was saying, We've confirmed that the review involves clinical records dating back approximately 3 years and encompasses multiple departments. The hospital has declined to comment beyond a brief statement saying they are cooperating fully with all regulatory bodies. We've been told that at least 2 senior staff members have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. She closed the laptop. She sat at her kitchen table. The coffee was still warm. Outside her window, the neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods did on Saturday afternoons. Someone mowing a lawn 2 houses down, a car alarm going off briefly and then stopping, a kid somewhere on a bike. Ordinary Saturday sounds. Her phone buzzed. Patricia. Holt was placed on leave this morning, building access suspended. Ferris sent an email to the department heads at 8 a.m. saying he was committed to full transparency in the review process. Nobody believes it. She read the message twice. She thought about Marcus Holt, the folded hands and the measured voice, and the 2 excellence awards on his office wall, and the steady eyes of a man who'd known, for a long time, that the machine would hold. She thought about what it must feel like to have believed that right up until the moment it stopped being true. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She thought it might feel like relief, or satisfaction, or the specific exhale of a long-held tension finally releasing. It felt more like something settling, the way things settled when they found the position they'd been moving toward for a long time. Patricia's next message, Are you okay? She started to type yes and then stopped and started again. Getting there, she wrote. She was putting her phone down when it rang, not a text, an actual call, a number she didn't know, with a Nashville area code. She answered. Ms. Voss, Vera Mack's voice. I want to update you on something that happened this afternoon. Gerald Ferris came in voluntarily to the field office at noon. A brief pause. He provided a full statement. He's agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for consideration on any charges related to his role in the administrative record amendments. She was quiet for a moment. He turned. He's positioning himself as a secondary actor. Whether that holds is for other people to determine. Mack paused again. He identified 3 individuals at the board level who he says directed his actions in the Weller case and instructed him to manage the Okafor admission in a way that protected the Varus Group exposure. 3 board members. 2 current, 1 former. We're executing on that now. She looked at the table, at her coffee cup, at the afternoon light on the wall. Ms. Voss, Mack said, I want you to know that the conduct report filed against you by Dr. Holt has been formally flagged as part of this investigation's document set. That means it cannot be amended, withdrawn, or acted upon by the hospital without federal notification. Another pause. And I want you to know that the clinical record of your actions during the Okafor admission, what you did, the decisions you made, the sequence of events, is now part of a federal evidentiary record. It says what it says. Nobody can change it. She thought about the paging log, about the lab timestamps, about the specific weight of 3 a.m. in a corridor, and a man who had 3 children and coached basketball and had been seconds from dying while a surgeon on a night shift watched his record from a terminal in another part of the building. Thank you for telling me, she said. You'll hear from us again when we need the formal deposition, Mack said. That'll likely be in 2 to 3 weeks. Another pause and Mack's voice shifted slightly. Not unprofessionally, just humanly. You did good work. The kind of work that's hard to do when nobody's watching. She was still holding the phone when the call ended. She set it on the table and let the quiet of the apartment settle around her for a moment. She thought about sitting in her car at the rest stop on the way back from Nashville, eating a gas station sandwich and watching trucks pass on the highway. She thought about the specific quality of those 15 minutes, the weight she'd been sitting inside and hadn't been able to fully feel yet. She could feel part of it now, not all of it. You couldn't feel all of it at once, but part. Her phone buzzed again. She looked down expecting Patricia or Bev or the group chain. It was a number she'd never seen before. A message, not a call. Ms. Voss. This is James Weller. Thomas Weller was my brother. Agent Mack gave me your number. I hope that's all right. I just wanted to say that I know what happened at that hospital. I know what you tried to do. And I know that the people who did this to my brother are being held accountable because of the work you started. I don't have better words than thank you. I hope that's enough." She read it once. She read it again. She set the phone down carefully, like it was something she didn't want to disturb. She sat at her kitchen table in the afternoon quiet, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself fully feel the distance she'd traveled. From the night she'd stood in a trauma bay with her hand on a stranger's abdomen and made a decision that no one thanked her for, that no one even acknowledged, that had in fact cost her everything she'd built in the preceding 9 months. She hadn't done it for acknowledgement. She hadn't done it for any reason that could be explained in a conference room or a conduct report or a statement to a federal agent. She'd done it because someone was dying and she knew how to stop it. She was still that person. Nothing that had happened in between had changed that. She picked up her phone and typed back to James Weller. "It's enough. I'm sorry about your brother. The people responsible will answer for it." She sent it and put the phone down and went to make dinner. She was halfway through cutting vegetables when her phone rang again. Conrad this time, which meant something new had happened because Conrad didn't call when things were settled, only when they weren't. She answered. "There's a problem," he said. She put down the knife. "What kind?" Ferris's cooperation statement. He named the 3 board members. Conrad's voice had the careful quality it got when he was managing information that needed to be delivered accurately. "One of them is local. Harwick. He has significant standing in this city. Hospital funding relationships, city council ties, 2 charitable foundations." A pause. "His name is Roland Vetch. He's been on Callaway's board for 9 years. "I don't know that name." "You wouldn't. He's the kind of person who operates in the layer below visible." Conrad paused. His attorney filed an emergency injunction this afternoon, not against the federal investigation. He can't touch that. Against the Joint Commission review. He's claiming procedural violations in the way the investigation was initiated, arguing that the complaint filings were based on improperly obtained materials. "The pharmacy printout," she said. "Among other things. He's specifically naming Renata Solis and arguing that her access to the medication record was unauthorized despite the fact that it was a routine pharmacy reconciliation." Another pause. "The injunction isn't likely to succeed, but it doesn't need to succeed to do damage. If it creates enough procedural ambiguity, it delays. If it delays long enough, the federal investigation proceeds regardless," she said. "Yes. But the Joint Commission review is what affects Holt's license and the hospital's accreditation. That's the piece that matters for the institutional accountability. The federal piece handles Ferris and the board members. But Holt—" Conrad stopped. "If the Joint Commission review is paused while the injunction is litigated, Holt stays on administrative leave but not formally stripped." "Correct." She thought about that. About Roland Vetch and his charitable foundations and his 9 years on a hospital board, and the specific mechanism of a man who operated in the layer below visible making one last move to protect his investment. She thought about Thomas Weller's sister in Memphis, and James Weller's text message, and Bev Holden's folder. "What does Sloan say?" she asked. "She says the injunction has a weak procedural argument and will likely be dismissed, but likely isn't certain and the timeline is uncertain." "Is there something that makes it certain?" A long pause. "There's one thing," Conrad said. "If the clinical record review produces a direct evidentiary connection between Holt's actions and the Weller death, not just anomaly, not just pattern, but causation, the Joint Commission doesn't need the complaint filings to proceed. They proceed on clinical grounds. The injunction becomes irrelevant because the basis of the review shifts." "What would establish causation?" "A clinical expert review of the Weller records with formal findings." He paused. "Someone who can look at what was administered, the timing, the documented decline in his GCS, and render an opinion about whether the medication administrations contributed to the outcome." He paused again. "Someone who knows trauma medicine well enough to make that case hold." She understood what he was telling her. She looked at the half-cut vegetables on her cutting board, and the knife beside them, and the ordinary kitchen around her, and the ordinary Saturday evening light in her ordinary apartment window. "When do they need it?" she said. "Mac's team is pulling the Weller records now. If someone could review them formally by Monday—" "I'll do it," she said. "Nora." Conrad. She picked up the knife. This is what I do. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'll have Max send you the records tonight. Tell her I'll have findings by Sunday afternoon. She put the phone down and went back to cutting vegetables, and outside her window the Saturday evening was doing what it was doing, indifferent and ordinary and ongoing. And in approximately 3 hours, a federal agent in Nashville was going to email her a dead man's medical file, and she was going to read it with the same attention she brought to everything, and she was going to find what was in it, because things that were in records were always findable by someone who knew how to look. The question that stayed with her while she finished cooking, the one she didn't have the answer to yet, was whether what she found would be enough to close the last door before Roland Vetch's attorneys found a way to hold it open. She ate dinner, she washed the dishes. At 9:17 p.m., Mac's email arrived. She opened the attachment, made a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down. Thomas Weller's medical file was 212 pages. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, starting at the beginning and moving forward without skipping, without looking for what she expected to find, because the thing about medical records was that what they didn't say was often as telling as what they did. She read the initial assessment, the triage notes, the imaging reports, the nursing documentation, the physician orders. She read the GCS scores tracked across the 4 hours he'd been alive in that building. She made notes in a spiral notebook she'd had since nursing school, the kind with the green cover that she'd bought in bulk and had been working through one at a time for years. She was on her third cup of coffee by midnight. By 1:30 a.m., she had found the first thing. It was in the medication administration record, in the way medication records held information when you knew how to read the gaps between entries. Thomas Weller had arrived with a GCS of 11, impaired but responsive, which for a TBI patient was within the range where aggressive management could produce meaningful outcomes. Standard protocol for a GCS of 11 in a trauma setting was careful ICP monitoring, oxygen positioning, and conservative pharmaceutical management. You did not sedate aggressively. You did not give anything that would artificially suppress the remaining neurological response. The goal was to preserve function while the brain's own regulatory mechanisms stabilized. At 12:47 a.m., Holt had ordered a bolus of a sedative agent at a dose that was on its own in a different patient for a different indication, within normal clinical range. But in a TBI patient with a GCS of 11, that dose had the predictable pharmacological effect of suppressing the very neurological response that was Weller's best remaining indicator of whether he was stabilizing or declining. After the administration, the nursing notes showed his GCS dropped to 8 within 30 minutes. At 8, the documentation changed in tone. The entries became sparser, the clinical picture darker. Holt's physician notes at 1:15 a.m. described the decline as consistent with progression of primary injury. He documented that he had discussed prognosis with team and had initiated comfort-focused management. No family had been contacted. No second opinion had been sought. No transfer to a higher-level neurological center had been initiated, despite the fact that Weller's initial presentation had been within the window where transfer could have been appropriate. The second medication administration came at 1:58 a.m. A different drug, same principle. Not palliative in intent as documented, but with a pharmacological profile that in a declining TBI patient would compound the suppression already underway. Thomas Weller's documented time of death was 3:47 a.m. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she'd written in the green notebook. It wasn't a smoking gun in the cinematic sense. There was no single entry that said what had been done and why. There never was. What there was a clinical sequence that, read by someone who understood trauma pharmacology, told a story that diverged from the documented explanation at two distinct points and didn't converge again. It was the kind of finding that required careful, precise language. That required her to say exactly what the record showed and exactly what her clinical opinion was about whether it was consistent with appropriate care, and to say both of those things without overstating or understating, because the value of the finding depended entirely on its accuracy. She wrote for 2 more hours. By 3:45 a.m., she had 11 pages of notes and a clinical opinion that was as honest as she knew how to make it, which was the only kind she was capable of producing. She went to bed. She woke at 7:15, read through what she'd written with the distance of a few hours of sleep, corrected 3 phrases that weren't precise enough, and one that said more than the record supported, and emailed the findings to Vera Mack at 8:52 a.m. Sunday morning. Mack's response came back in 23 minutes. Forwarding to the clinical review team now. This is thorough. Thank you. She made breakfast. She called her sister. She did not explain any of it in detail, just said that things were moving in a direction that looked like it was going to be all right, which was true, and which was the most she could offer when the shape of something wasn't fully resolved yet, and she was too tired to walk someone through the whole architecture of it. Her sister said, "Are you sleeping?" She said, "Better than I was." Her sister said, "Good, that matters." It did. The injunction filed by Roland Vetch's attorneys was denied on Tuesday morning. She found out from Sloan, who sent a 3-word text, "Dismissed with prejudice," which meant not just denied, but denied in a way that prevented refiling on the same grounds. The judge's written ruling, which Sloan forwarded an hour later, was 12 pages that used careful legal language to say, in essence, that the procedural argument was without merit, and that the public interest in the review proceeding outweighed any concerns about the manner in which the complaint had been initiated. Renata Solis's access to the medication record had been authorized. The printout she'd made had been appropriate to her professional role. The complaint had been properly filed. There was a paragraph near the end of the ruling that she read twice. It said that attempts to challenge legitimate whistleblower activity through procedural litigation were themselves a matter of concern, and that the court expected all parties to proceed in good faith with the established review processes. Roland Vetch's attorneys did not respond publicly. Roland Vetch himself had not made a public statement since the federal investigation had become known. His 2 charitable foundation websites had gone quiet. No new posts, no events listed. The kind of digital retraction that happened when someone's team told them to reduce their visible surface area. She thought about the layer below visible and what it looked like when the layer above it was removed. The Joint Commission's on-site review of Callaway Regional ran for 4 days. On the 3rd day, Patricia Whaley was interviewed for 2.5 hours. She texted Nora afterward, "I told them everything, every complaint I filed, every time it was reclassified, the 2021 conduct report they documented in my file, all of it. They recorded the whole thing." A pause, and then, "I think I've been waiting to say it out loud to someone who actually wrote it down." On the 4th day, Kira Strand and Mateo Garza were interviewed by phone, having submitted formal declarations that Sloan had helped them draft. Bev Holden came in person, drove 3 hours from where she was living now, and sat in a conference room at Callaway Regional Medical Center, the same building she'd been pushed out of 18 months ago, and gave her account for 90 minutes. She texted Nora after, "I wore the shoes I wore on my last shift. Probably nobody noticed, but I noticed." Nora read that message and felt something that didn't have a clean name, something between pride and grief and the specific tenderness of recognizing that people carried things in ways you'd never know unless they told you. "They noticed," she typed back. "I promise you, they noticed." The formal findings from the Joint Commission arrived in a public summary on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the on-site review had ended. She was at her kitchen table when Sloan sent the link. She opened it on her laptop and read it with her coffee going cold beside her because she forgot about it. The summary was 41 pages. It identified systemic failures in clinical oversight, documented a pattern of retaliatory conduct against nursing staff who raised patient safety concerns, and found that the hospital's administrative response to those concerns had prioritized institutional reputation over patient welfare in a manner inconsistent with accreditation standards. It named Marcus Holt by role and credential number. It cited his medication administration records across 4 cases as presenting significant questions of clinical appropriateness that had been referred to the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners for formal disciplinary review. His hospital privileges were suspended pending that review. It noted that administrative record amendments in multiple cases had been made from a single terminal under administrative credentials, and that this matter had been referred to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. It did not name Gerald Ferris by name in the public summary because Ferris's cooperation with the federal investigation meant his accountability would be adjudicated through that process. But it noted the administrative terminal. Anyone who needed to understand what that meant would understand. It cited, in a section on the pattern of nursing conduct complaints, the cases of 4 nurses who had been pushed out following documented safety concerns. It used the word retaliation. It used the word sustained. And in a section on page 37, in a paragraph about the admission of an unnamed patient on the night of the 14th, it described the clinical actions of the attending nurses appropriate, timely, and consistent with the highest standard of patient-centered care under adverse institutional conditions. She read that paragraph 3 times, not because she needed the validation, though some honest part of her acknowledged that it landed somewhere real, but because it was in a document that would exist in the permanent record of Callaway Regional Medical Center, in the administrative history of her nursing license, in the formal institutional memory of what had happened in that trauma bay at 3 a.m. when she'd been the only person in the room who was paying attention. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Patricia Whaley. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Did you read it?" Nora asked. 3 times, Patricia said. Her voice had something in it that Nora hadn't heard before. Not relief exactly, but something like the specific exhale of a person who had been holding something upright for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down. "You okay?" Nora asked. "I think so." A pause. "I've been here 19 years. I watched a lot of people come through. I watched a lot of good ones get pushed out, and I told myself I was staying because someone had to stay. Someone had to be there to remember. But I think I was also just—" She stopped. "I don't know. Scared, maybe. That's not a shameful thing. No. But I should have been louder sooner." "You were loud when it mattered," Nora said. "That's not nothing." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do now?" Nora looked at her kitchen window. The October light was coming in at a low angle, the kind that made everything look a little more considered than it usually did. "I have a job interview next week. Hospital in Clarksville. Different one, not the Node, just a regional medical center. Trauma floor." "Are you nervous?" "A little," she said, which was true. Not about the interview, about the starting over. The particular kind of courage it took to go back into a room where you'd been hurt before, knowing the room was different, but knowing you were carrying the memory of the last one. "Good," Patricia said. "You should be a little nervous. Means it matters." The accountability came in stages, the way accountability usually did when it involved institutions rather than individuals. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of formal findings and legal proceedings that accumulated into something that couldn't be walked back. Marcus Holt surrendered his medical license on a Wednesday in November, in a formal agreement with the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners that avoided a full public hearing in exchange for permanent surrender. The agreement's terms were public record. The board's summary statement said the surrender was accepted in light of findings of conduct inconsistent with patient safety standards across multiple cases. He did not issue a public statement. His attorney issued one on his behalf that said he was committed to personal reflection and accountability, which was the kind of language that meant the attorney had written it. She read the board's summary on a Tuesday evening and felt, surprisingly, very little. Not satisfaction, or not only satisfaction, mostly just the recognition that a thing that should have happened was happening, arriving late and imperfectly, but arriving. Gerald Ferris was charged federally in December. 2 counts of falsification of federal records, 1 count of obstruction. His cooperation agreement reduced his exposure significantly, which was the part of the justice system that never felt entirely clean. Watching someone who had participated in a man's death negotiate down because he was useful as a witness against people who had been more deliberate than he had. She understood why the system worked that way. Understanding it didn't make it comfortable. He resigned from Callaway Regional the day after the charges were filed. The resignation letter was brief and impersonal and did not contain the words "sorry." Roland Vetch was charged in January. The indictment was 12 counts and included federal contract fraud, conspiracy, and 2 counts related to his direction of the administrative cover-up. His bail hearing was public, and the amount set reflected the flight risk assessment that came with a man who had significant financial resources and no institutional position left to protect. His attorneys filed multiple motions in the following weeks. None of them meaningfully changed his situation. The 2 other board members, one current, one former, were charged in February as part of the same indictment. The Varus Group's federal contract was terminated in December, pending the outcome of the investigation. The Clarksville distribution node ceased operations. She didn't track all of this in real time. She heard about it in pieces. From Conrad, from Sloan, who sent updates with the regularity of someone who found organizational completion satisfying. From the news alert she'd stopped setting, but still sometimes saw. She tracked it the way you track things that had been important and were still important, but were no longer the primary thing your life was organized around, because her life had reorganized itself. No. The job interview in Clarksville was on a Wednesday. She drove up the night before and stayed at a chain hotel and ordered room service and watched an hour of television without retaining any of it and went to sleep at 10. She woke up at 5:45 from habit and lay in the unfamiliar room for a few minutes in the gray pre-dawn and thought about who she'd been 9 months ago when she'd walked into Callaway Regional for the first time. She'd been trying to be smaller than she was. That was the honest way to describe it. She'd thought that being smaller, quieter, less insistent, more willing to defer, was what you had to do to survive in a civilian institution after the life she'd had. She'd thought her job was to show up and be useful and not take up too much room. She understood now that she'd been wrong in a way that had cost her, but that the wrongness had also been reasonable. You learn things in difficult environments that didn't always translate cleanly, and one of the things she'd learned was that visible strength invited attack and quiet competence survived. That had been true in some contexts. It was not universally true. The hospital had taught her that silence wasn't the same as safety, and that the people most threatened by her competence weren't going to leave her alone just because she made herself small. They were going to come for her anyway, so she might as well be what she actually was. She got up, she showered, she put on the clothes she'd laid out the night before. She drove to the hospital. The trauma director's name was Dr. Adieze Nnoli, and she was direct in a way that Nora appreciated immediately. She asked questions and waited for full answers and didn't fill silences with reassurances. She had reviewed Nora's application and her nursing record, including the notation about the Callaway situation, which she addressed directly in the first 10 minutes. The conduct report from Callaway is suspended and under regulatory review, she said. I've read the Joint Commission summary. I'm aware of the context. She looked at Nora across the desk. I want to hear it from you. What happened? She told her. Not the federal investigation, not the board members, not the Varus Group. Those weren't hers to lead with. She told her what happened in that trauma bay on the night of the 14th. The patient, the assessment, the page, the decision, the outcome. Dr. Nnoli listened. When Nora finished, Nnoli said, Would you do it the same way again? She thought about it honestly rather than strategically. I'd document my concerns more thoroughly before escalating. I'd make the paper trail cleaner. She paused. But the intervention? Yes. Same way, same timing. Why? Because he was dying, and I knew how to stop it. Nnoli looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I have a night shift position on the trauma floor. It's not glamorous hours. The floor has good staff, but it's short 2 experienced nurses and has been for months. I work nights fine, Nora said. I know you do. Nnoli slid a folder across the desk. Look at the compensation package. If it works for you, the position is yours. She looked at the folder. She looked at the woman across the desk. You've already decided. I decided when I read the Joint Commission summary, Nnoli said. I wanted to meet you first. Make sure I was reading it right. She leaned back. I was. What? She started at Clarksville Regional on a Monday in early December, night shift, 23 weeks after she'd carried a box of belongings out of Callaway Regional in the morning light with nobody watching who knew what they were seeing. The trauma floor was different from Callaway's in the ways that trauma floors were different from each other. Different physical layout, different patient population, different institutional rhythms. The staff was short-handed in the way that short-handed units were, with the particular mix of exhaustion and solidarity that came from people who'd been carrying more than their share for long enough that it had become their baseline. She picked up the pace without making a performance of it, the way she'd always done. She absorbed the extra. She stayed late when it mattered. She learned the names and the habits and the histories of the people she was working alongside. She did not make herself smaller. She asked questions when she had them. She raised concerns through the right channels and followed up when they weren't addressed. She documented thoroughly and accurately and without hedging. When she disagreed with a clinical decision, she said so directly and on the record, in the respectful but unambiguous way of someone who had decided that the alternative was not a form of professionalism she was willing to practice anymore. The floor's charge nurse was a man named Terrell Bishop, who had been in trauma nursing for 15 years and had the specific calm of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him. On her third week after a busy shift, he stopped her in the corridor while she was finishing her notes. "You're good," he said. "It wasn't a compliment so much as an observation, the way you noted a fact." "I've been doing this a while," she said. "Not here," he said. "Takes most new nurses 2 months to find their rhythm here." He looked at her. "You came in with yours already." "I had a good reason to." He nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected. "This floor needs people who aren't going to flinch," he said. "We've had good people leave because they felt like nobody had their back." "Do they?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "They do now," he said. "I run this floor like that. And I don't let administrators run it different." He paused. "But having people who can hold the line clinical makes that easier." "Then I'll hold it," she said. He nodded again, once, and went back to his desk. She finished her notes and clocked out and walked to her car in the gray December morning, the cold air coming sharp off the fields to the east of the hospital building, and she stopped for a moment in the parking lot and just stood there. She stood there because it was worth standing there for a moment. Because she'd driven to this hospital from an apartment in Harwick where she'd been sitting in the quiet for weeks, unemployed and licensed with a federal flag shadowing her file, running in the mornings and waiting for the machine to move. Because before that she'd spent 9 months making herself smaller in a place that had been using her labor while systematically dismantling the possibility of her ever being safe there. Because before that she'd spent years in a different kind of service, in conditions she didn't talk about at dinner parties or on first dates, carrying the weight of it into every room she'd walked into since. She was not the same person she'd been in any of those places. She didn't think you were supposed to be. She got in her car and drove home. Darren Okafor called her the following week. He'd been released from all medical follow-up, cleared, healed, back to what he described as mostly normal, which, for a man who'd had abdominal surgery 10 weeks ago, she accepted as accurate without pushing. "I heard you're working again," he said. "Clarksville. Started Monday." "Good hospital?" "Good floor. Good charge nurse. Too many patients and not enough staff like every trauma floor in the country." He laughed, which was a sound she hadn't heard from him before. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "The report I filed. The Varus Group findings. They've been formally accepted as part of the federal contract review process. It's going to take another year at least, but the inquiry is real and it's moving." He paused. "It would have disappeared 6 months ago. All of it." "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know that part too, not just the hospital stuff. The thing it was actually about. The thing you almost died for." "Yeah." A pause. "My kids asked me what happened. Why I was in the hospital so long. I told them I was in an accident." Another pause. "I'm going to tell them the truth eventually. When they're old enough to understand why people do dangerous things for reasons that aren't obvious." "What will you tell them?" "That some things are worth it. That the alternative is letting it go, and letting it go means someone else pays for it instead of you." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you already know that. I think you've always known that." She thought about the night she'd stood at his bedside and made a decision that nobody thanked her for. She thought about the specific quality of that knowing, how it hadn't been noble in the moment, hadn't been calculated. It had just been what needed to happen, and she was the person there to do it. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he said. "The real kind of taking care, not just the functional kind." She thought about that for a while after she hung up. Conrad Briggs called her in January to tell her that the federal investigation had produced its first formal plea agreement, not Ferris's, which had come earlier, but one of the board members, a man named David Sutter, who had been the primary financial architect of the Varus Group relationship at the board level. He pled to 2 counts and agreed to testify. His cooperation was expected to close several remaining evidentiary gaps in the Weller case. "Vetch is still fighting," Conrad said. "He will for a while," she said. "That's what money buys you." "Yes, but it doesn't buy him the outcome anymore. Just the timeline." She thought about Roland Vetch in his layer below Visible, with his charitable foundations and his 9 years on a hospital board and the specific confidence of someone who had operated his whole life with the institutional weight of the world arranged behind him. She thought about what it felt like to have that weight shift. She thought it probably felt the way she'd felt in that conference room with its view of the parking structure. Like the room was tilted in a direction you hadn't prepared for. She hoped it did. She wasn't going to pretend she didn't hope it did. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." Conrad was quiet for a moment. "You did the work," he said. "I just opened the doors." "The doors mattered." "They usually do," he said. What? She got a letter from the Tennessee Board of Nursing in February. It was formal and bureaucratic and used the language of regulatory bodies, careful, specific, without room for ambiguity or sentiment. It informed her that following a review of the Callaway Regional Medical Center matter and in consideration of the Joint Commission findings, the board had determined that the conduct report filed against her license contained no basis for disciplinary action. The notation was removed from her record. Her license was returned to clean standing with a formal note that the prior flag had been the result of retaliatory institutional conduct. She read it at her kitchen table in the morning before her night shift, which meant she'd been awake for a while already, and the light in the apartment was doing the thing February light did in Tennessee, thin and tentative, not fully committed to the day. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept things she was going to need to hold on to. She thought about what it meant, not legally. She understood what it meant legally, but what it meant in the way things meant something when they'd cost something to get there. 9 months of being careful and useful and quiet. 1 night of being exactly what she was. Weeks of building a case in a brick building that didn't have its name on the door. A drive to Nashville at 6 in the morning with a rental car and an envelope. 11 pages of clinical notes at 2 a.m. with a dead man's records open on her laptop and cold coffee beside her. It meant that the record said what was true. That was what it meant. It was smaller than the cost, and it was also everything, in the way that having the record say what was true was everything, when the alternative was having it say something else and carrying that forever. She went to work that night. She worked a 12-hour shift that had the rhythm of trauma floors in February. 3 standard admissions, 1 pediatric that broke everyone's heart a little, in the specific way pediatric cases did regardless of outcome. A cardiac event in an elderly man named Morton who survived, and whose daughter cried in the hallway for 20 minutes, and then composed herself and said thank you to every nurse who walked past. Nora stayed 20 minutes past her shift end because there was a handoff that needed to be done right, and she was the person to do it. She drove home in the early morning and parked and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. She thought about what Darren Okafor had said, the real kind of taking care. Not just the functional kind. She was working on it. She was not the person who'd walked into Callaway Regional trying to be smaller than she was. She was not the person who'd carried boxes out of the building in the morning light, believing that doing the right thing was going to cost her everything with no accounting. She was not unchanged by any of it. You didn't go through something like this and come out the same on the other side. You came out knowing things you hadn't known before, about institutions, and how they protected themselves, about the specific courage of people like Patricia and Bev and Renata Solis, who had stayed in the building and kept the folders and showed up anyway, about the weight a person could carry in silence and what happened when they were finally given a room in which to set it down. She was someone who had been told, in the most concrete institutional terms available, that she was not worth protecting, and she had decided, without drama and without any particular speech about it, that she disagreed. That was the whole story, when you pulled it down to its bones. She had disagreed. She had kept disagreeing, and she had been right. The morning was coming up over the parking lot now, gray and cold and indifferent to what she'd been sitting in the car thinking about. She got out, she went inside. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with it, and looked at the thin February light coming through the window and thought about what she was going to do today, The ordinary today of a person who had come through something difficult and arrived at the other side still standing. She was going to sleep. She was going to eat something real. She was going to call her sister about the thing her sister had asked her about 2 weeks ago that she'd been putting off. She was going to run if her body wanted to run and sit still if it didn't. She was going to be someone who had fought for her own record and won, and was now going to do the work of figuring out what it meant to live in what came after. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. Not with all the weight already gone, because weight didn't go on a timeline you controlled. But fully, as herself. Because the thing nobody tells you about being underestimated your whole life is that eventually you have to stop waiting for the world to correct its assessment of you and just be the thing you know you are, in the rooms where you're standing, with the people who are watching, whether or not they're capable of seeing it yet. The rooms change. The people change. The scene catches up. She had waited long enough. She drank her coffee. She went to bed. And outside the window, the February morning kept arriving, slow and gray and ordinary, the way most mornings arrived, without ceremony, without fanfare, just one more day beginning in a world that had, quietly and completely, changed.